I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country.
Before sunrise, while most of the country slept, major U.S. news outlets reported that President Trump had sharply escalated his language toward Venezuela, warning that the threat now reached the level of American national security. According to multiple media briefings, members of Congress were informed in a series of briefings that a declaration of war or a large-scale military action could soon be announced during a nationwide address. Journalists described Washington as tense and unusually quiet, with officials preparing for what appeared to be a pre-planned scenario rather than a sudden decision. The pattern felt familiar because, in past federal operations against cartels and terror-linked networks, the pressure always built in the shadows long before the public understood what was unfolding. Subscribe to Military Power because this story is no longer about speeches or politics, and the next phase is already moving into action.
Maduro was a bad guy, frankly, under Biden. When the Venezuelan people voted in overwhelming numbers, Biden should have put more pressure on getting Maduro out then. It was a mistake.
President Trump's shift toward Venezuela was not presented as a sudden outburst, but the press described it as a calculated escalation that unfolded over several tense days. Major American outlets reported that the language coming from the White House had hardened, moving away from diplomatic caution and toward direct warnings that carried military weight. This change stood out because it echoed moments from past federal crackdowns when authorities spoke firmly in public while preparing action behind closed doors. The message was clear and deliberate, signaling that Venezuela was no longer being discussed as a distant political problem, but as an active security concern tied to American interests. According to news coverage, Trump framed the situation as one where patience had run out, and consequences were now on the table. Journalists noted how his words avoided technical policy language and instead relied on blunt terms that ordinary Americans could understand. He spoke about threats, danger, and responsibility, choosing phrases that suggested force rather than negotiation. In this way, the rhetoric sounded less like a diplomatic warning and more like the early phase of a law enforcement operation when suspects are informed that compliance has ended and action is forthcoming. Media reports emphasized that this approach was intentional, as it placed pressure not only on Venezuela, but also on its allies and observers across the region. When a president speaks in this tone, it sends a signal simultaneously through military channels, intelligence agencies, and foreign governments. Reporters compared it to moments before major drug raids in the United States, when officials speak openly about danger to justify firm action while keeping operational details sealed. The escalation was not about emotion, but about positioning, creating a public record that could later support stronger steps. Coverage also highlighted how Trump tied his warnings to the idea of protection, a theme familiar to Americans who follow crime and enforcement stories. By framing Venezuela as a source of instability and threat, the president placed himself in the role of a commander acting to shield the nation. This narrative has been used before in campaigns against transnational gangs, where leaders argue that decisive action abroad prevents violence at home. The tone suggested that waiting longer would only allow the situation to grow more dangerous. Several outlets noted that the president repeatedly mentioned consequences without spelling them out, which contributed to the sense of tension. This tactic is common in enforcement operations, where uncertainty can be as powerful as force. When suspects are unsure of the next step, pressure builds quickly. In the same way, Trump's language created a vast space of possibilities, leaving room for military options while avoiding direct commitments in public. The press described Washington as attentive and alert during this period, with reporters tracking every statement and every shift in wording. Small changes in phrasing were treated as signals, much like subtle movements during a surveillance operation. Observers noted that officials around the president avoided softening his message, reinforcing the impression that this was a unified stance rather than personal rhetoric. This coordination suggested preparation rather than improvisation. Analysts interviewed by the media emphasized that such language often serves as a foundation for subsequent actions, particularly when public support is required. Before raids against organized crime networks, authorities usually present a narrative of danger and urgency to justify the use of force. Trump's warnings followed a similar pattern, building a narrative where strong measures could be presented as necessary and justified. The emphasis on military consequences closely aligns with this pattern. Reporting also noted that the president's words reached far beyond Venezuela's borders. Governments across the Caribbean and South America paid close attention, understanding that shifts in American tone often precede shifts in posture. For countries that rely on stable trade and travel routes, the language raised concerns about what might follow. The escalation was not isolated, but part of a regional signal that conditions were changing. The comparison to law enforcement grew stronger as coverage examined how threats were framed as preventative rather than aggressive. Trump did not describe action as punishment, but as protection against future harm. This mirrors the logic used when police dismantle gang operations before violence spills into the streets. The message suggests that acting early is safer than reacting later, even if the measures appear harsh. As the rhetoric continued, reporters observed that the administration avoided offering timelines or limits. This open-ended approach maintained flexibility and kept attention focused on the possibility of action rather than its details. In enforcement terms, it resembled a situation where suspects know an arrest is coming, but cannot predict when it will occur. The pressure lies in the waiting. The tone of coverage reflected a growing belief that the escalation was a deliberate first step in a broader sequence. Words were being used to prepare the public, align agencies, and warn opponents simultaneously. While no single statement confirmed what would happen next, together they formed a pattern that suggested planning and resolution. This stage set the conditions for discussions that would soon follow about control of movement, access, and space around Venezuela. These developments naturally led journalists and officials to turn their attention to the next layer of pressure, where talk of sea and air restrictions began to emerge as the logical extension of the president's escalating warnings.
Bold move by the Trump administration declaring Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and his government among the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations. The announcement allows President Trump to move in on Venezuela.
Reporters described the atmosphere on Capitol Hill as tense and unusually quiet after members of Congress were privately briefed on the situation in Venezuela. According to multiple outlets, these sessions were closed, limited, and carefully controlled, with lawmakers receiving warnings that a declaration of war or a significant military action could be announced during a national address. No detailed plans were shared, and no documents were released, which only deepened the sense that decisions were being shaped outside public view. This secrecy mirrored moments before extensive federal crackdowns, when investigators briefed judges and officials just enough to prepare them for what was to come. The lack of detail led journalists to repeatedly ask the same question: whether the decision had already been made. Coverage emphasized how rare such briefings are when no immediate vote is required. Lawmakers were not asked to authorize funding or approve new laws, yet they were told to be ready. That detail stood out to reporters who follow national security closely. In past enforcement operations against organized crime, similar warnings were used to prevent leaks and prepare institutions for rapid change. Here, the same logic applied, suggesting that speed and control mattered more than debate. The silence that followed the briefings became part of the story. Members of Congress avoided specifics when questioned, and staff offices declined to comment. This restraint signaled discipline rather than confusion. In crime cases, silence often means coordination, not uncertainty. Journalists interpreted the quiet as evidence that officials were aligning messages and waiting for the right moment to speak publicly. As speculation grew, attention shifted to how the administration justified its stance. Officials framed their actions around claims of terrorism and drug-related threats, linking Venezuela to networks described as dangerous and organized. The term narco-terrorism appeared repeatedly in statements summarized by the press. This language carried weight because it placed the issue in the same category as cartel violence and transnational crime that Americans already understand. It suggested a threat that crosses borders and demands force. However, reporters also noted a gap between the claims and the evidence presented. No names were released, no case files were shared, and no public indictments were shown to support the allegations. This absence became a focal point of coverage. In domestic gang cases, authorities usually display seized drugs, weapons, or records to demonstrate credibility. Here, the public was asked to trust the assessment without seeing proof. The contrast grew sharper when journalists compared U.S. claims with international actions. European sanctions against Venezuela were renewed, yet official explanations focused on governance and rights rather than drug trafficking. This difference raised questions about whether the narco-terrorism label reflected intelligence findings or strategic framing. Analysts quoted by the media said such labels can shape public opinion even before evidence is disclosed. Despite the lack of public proof, the narrative gained momentum through repetition. Each mention reinforced the image of a hidden criminal threat. In gang enforcement stories, repetition often prepares the ground for arrests by normalizing the idea of danger. The same pattern appeared here as officials emphasized risk while withholding detail. The message was clear, even if the files were sealed. While debate over evidence continued, coverage also tracked physical movements that suggested preparation. Reports confirmed an expanded U.S. military presence in the region around Venezuela through regional bases and agreements. In Ecuador, activity at Manta Air Base drew attention, with observers noting its strategic position for surveillance and response. This location has been used before in counter-drug operations, linking it to familiar enforcement roles. In the Caribbean, the installation of American radar systems in places like Tobago added another layer of complexity. Radar does not announce itself loudly, yet it changes the balance by seeing everything that moves. Journalists describe these systems as quiet tools that extend reach without confrontation. In policing, surveillance often comes before arrests, and this buildup followed that logic closely. Further south and north, military cooperation agreements across Central and South America were highlighted as part of the same picture. Training programs, shared facilities, and logistical access created a network rather than a single deployment. This approach mirrored how task forces are built to surround criminal organizations from multiple angles. No single base carries the weight alone, but together they restrict space and options. Analysts told reporters that this strategy suggested containment rather than immediate attack. By positioning assets around Venezuela, the United States appeared to be shaping the environment. In gang operations, containment prevents escape and limits response. The comparison resonated with audiences familiar with law enforcement tactics. Importantly, coverage avoided describing these movements as random or symbolic. Each placement served a purpose, extending observation and readiness. The buildup did not require public announcements because its impact was felt quietly. That silence matched the earlier secrecy on Capitol Hill, reinforcing the sense of a coordinated plan unfolding in stages. As journalists connected these elements, a pattern emerged that linked rhetoric, justification, and positioning. Words prepared minds, labels shaped perception, and assets altered reality on the ground. None of these steps alone confirmed what would happen next, but together, they narrowed the range of possibilities. In crime reporting, such narrowing often precedes action. The absence of open evidence continued to trouble some observers, yet it did not slow preparation. Officials appeared willing to move forward while keeping details classified. This approach has precedent in high-risk operations, where exposure could undermine success. Reporters reminded readers that many significant arrests only make sense once evidence is revealed later. By the end of this phase, attention turned toward how pressure might soon translate into visible control over movement and access. With Congress warned, threats defined, and forces positioned, the next question was not whether escalation would continue, but where it would appear first. That question pointed directly toward discussions about restricting space through sea and air measures that would soon dominate headlines.
Cartels, they've got a lot of drugs flowing, so we want to protect our country. We have to protect our country. We haven't been doing it for 4 years, and we love this country like they love their countries. We have to protect our country. So, we're playing a tough game, but we'll have more to say about that soon. Yes, ma'am.
The first visible impact of the campaign appeared far from meeting rooms and microphones, out on open water, where small boats move through long stretches of sea with little warning. Reports described strikes on vessels accused of pushing drugs through known routes, actions carried out with speed and control. These boats did not drift away or vanish by chance. They were stopped and sunk in a way that showed reach and intent. For supporters of President Donald Trump, these operations represented a clear decision to confront criminal systems directly rather than allowing them to hide behind distance and darkness. Accounts gathered by reporters described sudden disruption across familiar waters. Routes that once felt routine became tense and uncertain overnight. Crews that had crossed these paths for years now slowed down, changed direction, or avoided them entirely. Life along the coast adjusted quickly, not solely because of fear, but also because the freedom of movement had changed. In gang enforcement stories, this moment is familiar when a network realizes its corridors are no longer safe and must adapt or collapse. The sinking of the boat sent a message that went beyond the immediate target. It told smugglers that speed, silence, and experience were no longer enough to protect them. It also told surrounding communities that the government was serious about stopping illegal flows before they reached deeper into society. Supporters argued that this firmness protects families and neighborhoods by cutting off dangerous trade early, long before it can fuel violence elsewhere. In that sense, action at sea was framed as prevention rather than punishment. Coastal communities tied to maritime trade felt the effects almost immediately. Fishermen, dock workers, and small traders had to adjust their routines as security increased. Journalists observed how people connected to Trinidad and Colombia experienced disruptions in their daily lives as inspections tightened and familiar schedules shifted. The focus remained on adaptation rather than blame, as ordinary workers learned to operate under new conditions. This mirrored what happens in American cities when police close streets controlled by gangs and traffic patterns change overnight. Along the shore, the change was not only visible, but also felt in small, practical decisions made every morning. Boat owners checked their radios twice, and crews watched the horizon more closely before leaving. Families who depended on day trips began planning fuel and supplies with extra caution because delays now meant lost income. Local markets adjusted as seafood arrivals became less predictable, and transport drivers built new routes to avoid bottlenecks near ports. For Trump supporters, this was the unavoidable friction of restoring order, because criminal traffic only survives when normal people are forced to look away to keep communities safe. Supporters of the administration described these disruptions as temporary and necessary. They compared them to neighborhoods affected during large drug raids, where inconvenience comes before relief. The reasoning was straightforward. Criminal networks rely on predictability, and once that predictability is disrupted, their power is weakened. The strikes at sea followed this logic, removing comfort and forcing illegal operators into uncertainty. As attention shifted from the water to broader issues, the campaign expanded into economic and digital spaces. Reports confirmed cyber actions aimed at PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, designed to weaken the systems that support illicit networks. These actions lacked dramatic visuals, yet their impact reached deep into operations. In modern enforcement, cutting access to money and coordination often proves more effective than chasing individuals one by one. Oil pressure became another tool in this strategy. Restrictions and sanctions limited the free movement of resources, thereby tightening the environment around state-linked systems. Businesses across the region began reviewing plans as shipping schedules shifted and contracts faced uncertainty. Supporters of President Trump viewed this pressure as disciplined and strategic, forcing criminal structures to feel consequences without relying on endless confrontation. Regional companies reacted quickly to rising tension. Airlines, shipping firms, insurers, and logistics providers adjusted risk calculations as conditions changed. Journalists described meetings where managers discussed backup routes and new safeguards. This response reflected a familiar pattern from major gang takedowns when the removal of a key distributor sends shockwaves through connected businesses. Even those not directly involved feel the impact. Cyber pressure added a quieter layer to the campaign. Unlike strikes at sea, digital actions left no wreckage, but they slowed systems and created confusion. Reports suggested that networks tied to energy and transport faced disruptions that forced leaders to focus on defense instead of growth. This shift drained attention and resources, a common tactic in enforcement efforts meant to exhaust criminal groups over time. As these pressures built, analysts began warning about wider regional effects. Instability rarely remains confined to a single area. Colombia, given its proximity and history, was seen as vulnerable to spillover as routes closed and activity searched for new paths. In gang wars, crackdowns in one district often push movement into another, testing nearby communities. The Caribbean faced similar concerns. Islands that rely on trade and tourism are sensitive to tension, and even minor disruptions can significantly impact daily life. Commentators warned that prolonged pressure could strain economies that were already balancing on narrow margins. In enforcement terms, this resembled a citywide operation, where increased patrols affected surrounding neighborhoods, even if the focus remained targeted. Central America was also considered another potential pressure point. Analysts suggested that as routes tightened elsewhere, networks might test boundaries further south or north. This behavior is well known in gang conflicts, where shutting down one area leads to activity shifting rather than ending. Coordination across borders becomes essential to prevent displacement rather than resolve it. Supporters of the president acknowledged these risks while defending the strategy. They argued that allowing criminal systems to operate freely poses a greater danger over time. From this view, decisive action creates an opportunity to restore order and establish more precise boundaries. Strong leadership, they believed, prevents chaos from spreading unchecked. Journalists also observed that official messaging remained calm and measured, statements focused on control and prevention rather than dramatic language. This restraint reinforced the idea that actions were planned and disciplined. In law enforcement, steady execution often signals confidence and preparation. The combined effect of strikes, economic pressure, and regional anxiety marked a shift into a new phase. This stage was no longer about warnings or preparation alone, but about visible change in behavior and environment. Routes altered, systems slowed, and attention sharpened across borders. Each move reduced the space available for illegal activity. For audiences familiar with gang wars, the pattern felt clear. First comes pressure, then restriction, and finally, isolation. Sea strikes removed physical freedom. Economic pressure reduced financial comfort, and regional vigilance narrowed alternatives. Together, these steps formed a tightening circle around criminal movement. As that circle narrowed, observers began looking toward what sustained pressure might produce. Questions emerged about stability, adaptation, and long-term balance. Once the immediate phase settled, those questions pointed toward the next stage of the story, where analysts would begin mapping future scenarios and the broader consequences of prolonged enforcement across an entire region. Taken together, the developments surrounding Venezuela reveal a clear and deliberate chain of escalation rather than a series of isolated events. It began with language, as President Trump moved from diplomatic pressure to firm public warnings, that framed the situation as a direct threat to American security. Those words were not empty, as they had prepared institutions, allies, and the public for the actions that would soon follow. In enforcement history, this stage often marks the moment when authorities stop signaling and start positioning, and the pattern here follows that familiar path. The next phase focused on restriction, as discussions of sea and air blockades entered the public space. Control of movement is a classic tool in both policing and warfare, as it limits options without requiring immediate confrontation. By signaling the possibility of maritime and air control, the administration indicated that it was willing to shape the environment around Venezuela rather than react to it. For the Caribbean, where trade and travel depend on open routes, even the idea of restriction carried serious weight. Military positioning reinforced that message. The buildup of forces around the region, supported by bases, radar systems, and security agreements, showed preparation rather than improvisation. In gang operations, surrounding a target is often the step that precedes decisive action. Here, the same logic is applied on a regional scale, with assets placed to observe, deter, and, if necessary, act. Each movement reduced uncertainty about intent while increasing pressure on the ground. Direct force soon followed as strikes on boats accused of drug trafficking pushed the confrontation into a new and irreversible phase. These incidents raised immediate questions about civilian harm and legal authority, especially after the deaths of foreign nationals were reported. The use of force at sea transformed abstract warnings into tangible consequences, changing how governments, businesses, and the public viewed the situation. At the same time, economic sanctions and cyber pressure deepened the impact. By targeting oil revenue, financial systems, and critical infrastructure, the campaign extended beyond the use of military tools alone. This layered approach mirrored strategies used against organized crime, where cutting money and communication weakens networks over time. The result was pressure that reached far beyond Venezuela, affecting companies and communities across the Caribbean. Viewed as a whole, these steps form a coherent sequence of escalation. Words justified restriction, restriction enabled positioning, positioning led to force, and economic and cyber measures reinforced force. This is not the pattern of a hypothetical conflict, but of one that is actively taking shape. Analysts warn that such momentum is difficult to reverse, especially once multiple actors feel the effects. Subscribe to Military Power to stay informed as this situation continues to unfold, because understanding the progression of events is critical in moments like this. In your view, is this merely a strategy of deterrence by President Trump, or the opening chapter of a real conflict in the Caribbean?